Okay, hello everyone. We can start. I have the great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Çağlar Akçay from the sunny Istanbul. Çağlar is a great biologist. He started his undergraduate studies in psychology and biology in Turkey, Ankara. And then he moved to the United States, where he stayed for quite some time. He did his master's in cognition and perception in the University of Iowa City, United States. And then he started his PhD in animal behavior at the University of Washington, Seattle. Then Çağlar did a couple of postdocs, first at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Then he was a research scientist and lecturer at Seattle. So he moved back to Seattle. And then from Washington State, he went to Virginia. And that was the time when actually I was there as a research scientist. And Çağlar came to join our team. And it was really fantastic to work together. So this is the time we've known each other since then. And then he spent 3 years there as a postdoc and research scientist, and then moved back to his home country, to Turkey, to Istanbul, where he is at the prestigious private university, the Koç University, where he's still now. Çağlar has really broad interest, but what I really like about his research is that he really focuses on animal behavior. So he's really interested in a lot of different things, but mainly in animal behavior, cognition, birdsong, and this is the topic that he's going to talk about now. But Çağlar's interest actually span a wide range of different things, not just in biology, but even outside that. Of course, he likes hiking. He's a great photographer. He's actually a good sailor, so if you have any questions about sailing, he might be able to. I don't know if he's practicing it recently, but he is a good sailor.
All right, now I have to interrupt that because that's not safe to say.
Okay. But of course, his most recent passion is parental care that he's doing. He is a lovely young son, and so he's a really diverse and versatile person in the research of animal behavior. And today he's going to talk about learning birdsong. And so with that, please welcome Çağlar.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, so I was sailing in Seattle, and I learned sailing in Seattle, and I was known for running aground all the time. So that's why I was kind of interrupting. But I've never sank a boat, so I guess that's something. All right, so let me share my screen again if I can. Here we go. Thank you for that really nice introduction, which I really don't deserve, but here we go. So I'm going to talk about birdsong learning today, and specifically social factors in birdsong development. And birdsong learning is really what I got into animal behavior. As Adam explained, I kind of was trained or my undergraduate was in psychology and biology, and the reason I did double major was that I actually wanted to be a neuroscientist and study consciousness and stuff like that. And then I kind of decided that cognitive psychology or cognitive science wasn't really for me, and I didn't really want to get stuck in the lab, so I kind of decided to study animal behavior, which was still behavior, but you got to be out in the field. And birdsong learning is actually a really nice topic because it's actually, as I'm going to make the point later, it's actually a great model to study both evolution and development and how they interact. Okay, so before I get to that, let me just give an overview of what I do in general. So I study social behavior in general. That's how I conceptualize my work, social behavior and cognition, and we see social behavior in all different contexts. So, for instance, we see social behavior in communication, like these honeybees, for instance, doing honeybee dance, or in sexual interactions, like these peacock spider, that is where the male dances and shows his colors to the female, and hopefully they get, and then the female likes it, and they get to mate, and then the female eats the male, and so on. We of course see social interactions in the context of parental care, like these emperor penguins, and that they have to coordinate their parental activities to successfully care for their young, or in the context of predator vigilance, or just staying alive and not getting eaten, and that can be a social activity. And of course, we see social behavior in the context of aggression, and a lot of talks, social behavior that I'm going to talk about today is actually has to do with aggression. And these are the lovely tree swallows that Adam and I worked on when we were at Virginia Tech together. Of course, we see social behavior in contexts that are not kind of well-defined biological context. Maybe, for instance, this is a play context, which is a much more complicated to analyze, at least context where there's definitely social interactions going on. Okay, so in all of these contexts, animals have taken this social information and processed that. Okay, so this information is about food, could be about predators, could be about mates, potential mates or actual mates. Could be about relatives and who's your ally, who's your competitor, etc. Okay, all of this social information has to be processed by the animal, and the processes that allow this what I'm going to term social cognition, and that's a very psychological process. But really, this is basically any process, any cognitive process that takes in information that is of social value and process it and use it in a fitness relevant way. Okay, and how these social cognitive processes work are affected by a great many things, like, for instance, the prior social experience of the animal, the developmental history of the animal, the physiological state of the animal, and of course the genetic background of the animal. And the social cognitive processes and how animals respond to social stimuli in turn affect fitness. Okay, fitness is defined as how many copies of your genes you pass down to the next generation, essentially. Okay, which in turn affects the evolution of the social cognitive process. So this is how I kind of conceptualize my work and how I study social cognition. So these are the processes that I'm interested in. And over the years, I've done I pursued several different lines of research related to this big question. The first line of research that I pursued during my PhD was and first postdoc is how do animals keep track of their rivals or friends and relatives in cooperative and competitive contexts. So I did a lot of playback experiments simulating social scenarios and looked at how animals responded to these social scenarios. Then Adam and I actually worked together on parental care and how physiological states affect parental care, and how animals respond to, again, social stimuli in this case, for instance, nestling, begging calls, and how that affect their social, how they affect their behavior and their coordination with their other partner and their physiological state. And more recently, I've been working on how signals evolve to be honest and how they're used in a risky and increasingly noisy world. So a lot of my recent work has been on anthropogenic noise and how that affects animal communication systems. And then finally, which is what I'm going to talk about today, is how the social function of signals shape the developmental programs of those signals. How those signals develop to serve a function, and how does this evolve? Processes evolve together. Okay, so I'm going to jump right into the topic of vocal learning in animals. Okay, so almost all animals use vocalization. Vocalization is almost ubiquitous in animal kingdom. It's a very common way of communicating with other individuals, whether they're conspecifics or heterospecifics. But as far as we know, at least, vocal learning of those signals, learning of those signals of those vocalizations is quite rare in animals. And there's actually only a handful of groups of animals that does that. Of course, humans do, right? We learn language socially, and we can learn any language, that we are exposed to in principle, right? As we age, it gets harder and harder, but, kids, when they're young, they can learn any language if they, Then there's cetaceans like dolphins and whales that actually also are able to learn their vocalizations, and that serves a very important social function. There is bats, some of the bats at least that have been studied are shown to learn their vocalizations. And when we talk about learning vocalizations, we're talking about the acoustic structure, the production of those acoustic structure that is learned, okay? Not just the usage of the vocalizations, but the actual acoustic structure that we're talking about, okay? And a lot of times these has to be learned in bats and cetaceans. And there are birds. There are at least 3, maybe 4, maybe more. So there's hummingbirds that have been shown to learn their vocalizations. There's of course the parrots, right? And if you've seen the recent issue in Philosophical Transactions of Royal Society, there is actually a paper that shows Musk ducks are able to learn vocalizations, in this case, human vocalizations, human kind of phrases. And if this is true, and there's actually anecdotal evidence apparently scattered throughout the literature, I didn't know this, but apparently ducks potentially are also vocal learners. However, apparently they learn exclusively swear words, so which kind of makes sense because they talk like a sailor. That makes sense, right? And of course, there's the songbirds, and songbirds are the model system of vocal learning in biology because first of all, they're numerous and they're actually experimentally very tractable both in the lab and in the field. And there's actually there's about 4,000 plus species of songbirds that presumably we haven't actually studied all of them, but the assumption is that they all learn their vocalization in some way, one way or the other. Yeah. And the reason why songbirds have attracted attention academically is that, well, first of all, their songbirds are cute and they're pleasant to listen to oftentimes, but also there's actually a lot of parallels between language learning and birdsong learning, and that has kind of attracted the attention of at least funders, but also academicians and as a model system. So early studies in songbirds seem to show that there's a sensitive period for song learning, beyond which song learning wasn't really possible. So most of the species that have been studied early on, like white-crowned sparrows or song sparrows, seem to learn their songs in their first year, or in fact in the first couple of months, and then they don't kind of learn new things beyond that. And that seemed to be kind of similar to how humans learn, for instance, where we don't really have a kind of sensitive or critical period, but in humans, there is actually a kind of a more, I guess it would be called sensitive period where vocalization learning or language learning is much more possible than in later years. So that seems to be like a parallel with birdsong learning. We are predisposed as humans to learn human vocalizations. That seems to be the case, at least in some songbirds that have been studied earlier. So selectivity for conspecific vocalizations. There was also this developmental process of babbling or subsong that is, that we are well aware in, human babies, for instance, before they can speak, they actually start babbling and making these nonsense sounds. And that, so birds also have this subsong stage and so on. And one other parallel that I'm going to actually emphasize is that it's a very social process. Both language learning and birdsong learning is a very social process. But beyond that, birdsong learning is also a great model system to study cultural evolution because it's a wild system. There's potential for comparative analysis, and there is potential for keeping track of how cultural evolution happens in the field, in the wild, right? Now, the way we started studying birdsong learning was first in the 50s and 60s, really. It started with Peter Marler's class of studies. He brought back baby birds from the field into the lab and put them in a cage and basically tutored them with songs played from a tape. And these were 60s, so that was like reel-to-reel tapes and so on. And songs were given from a speaker. And he showed experimentally that these birds were not born with the songs that they sing eventually, but they had to actually learn. So if you actually didn't give them, these baby birds that were raised in the lab, any experience of song, they didn't actually develop their normal species song, so species typical song. Okay, so these so-called tape tutors were really important to show that song learning happened in the first place. Okay, it was actually a learned signal, and the flip side of this paradigm, however, is that this is a very asocial process that's been simulated here, right? So you have a bird that's in a cage by itself, oftentimes, and there is no social interaction. There's just a speaker that occasionally sings a song, and that's it. And you may try to interact with the speaker, but the speaker doesn't interact back with you, right? So there's no social factors, right? And a lot of what we know of personal learning has come from studies like this, and this is actually a still very widely used paradigm, which is because it's a very powerful experimental paradigm. It controls for everything, pretty much, except for what what the bird hears from a speaker. But then further studies in the 80s, especially, kind of expanded this paradigm, where if you actually give birds in the lab more social experience, then some of the rules of the song learning, some of the rules of learning were actually bent or even actually broken. Okay, so for instance, classic studies of Marler that did with white-crowned sparrow showed that there's a census period which basically closed at 50 days of age, and beyond which they couldn't learn any new songs, and that was the rule of song learning in this species. And they only learned the white-crowned sparrow song, so there was an innate template, and that's another rule. Okay. Now, Baptiste and Petrunovich in the 1980s showed that if you actually give them a real bird, as was a speaker, if you put them in a cage with a real bird, or if you put a cage with a real bird next to their cage, maybe not put them in the same cage because they might fight, but if you put a cage with the real birds next to their own cage, then they will actually first learn later than 50 days, okay? And they will learn pretty much anything. Well, not necessarily anything, but they will learn definitely heterospecific songs. In this case, for instance, they learned the song of a strawberry finch, which is an exotic species that is not found in the Northern America, where white-crowned sparrows live, okay? So both of these rules of sensitive periods and heterospecific or conspecific template, those rules were bent or broken, okay, with live tutor. So that kind of drives home the point that, or drove home the point that these social interactions are important in song learning. Somehow this live bird was much more potent stimuli than a speaker that plays a song occasionally, okay? But what these social interactions are, or social factors are, hasn't been really answered that much. Okay, so these experiments do show that there's social factors are important in song learning, but how exactly they are important, we don't really know. Okay, and by the way, I've been talking about sensitive periods and conspecific templates, etc. But the reason why songbirds is a really great model system is that there's so many of them, and they all do slightly different things. Okay. So for instance, indigo buntings learn only in their first years, much like the white-crowned sparrows, but pied flycatchers keep learning throughout their lives, right? So that's actually something that's different, and there's actually a lot of species that learn throughout their lives, right? Swamp sparrows only learn a few songs, okay, about 3 songs or so, but northern mockingbirds copy almost anything, and swamp sparrows only learn swamp sparrow songs, right? Whereas northern mockingbirds basically mimic anything, okay? In some species, and actually a lot of species, males and females both sing, but in other species, only the males sing. And that tends to be also correlated with whether the species is tropical or temperate and so on, with female song being less prevalent in temperate song zones, or northern temperate zones, I should say. But it appears that the female song is actually ancestral. It's actually what happened is apparently female song was gradually lost as the songbirds kind of radiated towards northern temperate zones from southern latitudes. Okay, and then chipping sparrows only learn a single song. They only have a single song that they sing, whereas great-winged warblers sing dozens of song types, okay, that they learn throughout their life. So this kind of allows for a lot of comparative studies of songbirds and song learning, and how evolutionary function of the song kind of affects the development, the song learning programs. So the big question is, how does social function shape bird song learning programs? That's the big question that I'm kind of interested in this context. And with this, when we talk about birdsong, we talk about mainly 2 functions: interaction with same-sex individuals. This could be either cooperative or competitive. Cooperative interactions, for instance, include coordination of group activities, especially in group-living birds, or competitive, where birds sing to navigate territorial interactions, for instance. Okay. And then, of course, birdsong often is thought to have a second function, which is mate attraction. Okay, and this applies to both males and females to some degree, to varying degrees in different species. Okay, but I'm going to talk about mostly same-sex individuals, and the species that I'm going to talk about is song sparrows, where only the males sing. So I'm going to focus on male-male interactions in this talk. Okay, and I'm going to specifically talk about how cooperation and competition with conspecific shape song learning in the song sparrow. And this is a good time to introduce my study species, the song sparrow, which is a North American nivorous sparrow that is found throughout North America, from Mexico to Canada. It's a species that's very common in pretty much all across the continent. It's very good urban adapter, so you can actually find them in a lot of cities as well. It's a species in which only the males sing, and I say this with a caveat that the females do sometimes sing, but it's much rarer. Okay, so there's female song in song sparrows as well, but it's kind of sporadic, and it's not clear what the function. There hasn't been really very good studies of female song that much. Each male has a repertoire of 8 to 9 different song types, as I'm going to show you in a minute. And they are close-ended learners, which means that they learn their songs during their first year from unrelated males that oftentimes end up being their neighbor. And they do not change their song repertoire after first year. So that's what I mean by close-ended learners. And in the study site that we study them, the neighboring males share song types, and I'll show you in a minute what that is. But first, this is our study site. This is Discovery Park, which is a very nice urban park in Seattle. There's a very large park bordered by Puget Sound, this body of water here, and we have a bunch of song sparrows in this part of the park. And this is in northwestern United States, right on the Canada border. And this is where my teacher, my PhD advisor, had been studying them since 1986. Here he is seen with some research equipment in his hands, and he's been studying, the function and development of songs since 1986. And I joined his group in 2006, and we've been we kept the project going for until very recently, actually, when he retired. And so this is the study site, and in our study site in the Pacific Northwest, song sparrows, neighbors share song types. So this is actually a bunch of different song types from one male, which is on this column, and another male, which is on this column here. Okay, and these are spectrograms, which is basically time versus frequency. Basically, these are visual representations of song, and hopefully I will play, and you can hear the songs and how they sound like. So. Did you hear that? Yes. Okay.
Yes, we did.
Okay, great. So this is one song, for instance, and so this was the version of the song that is sung by male 1, and this is the version of the song that is sung by male 2. For comparison, and if they sound similar to you, and that's because they are actually shared. Okay, so they share this element, these 2 introductory notes, and there's a buzz, that as we call them, and there's a trill here, and there's an ending buzz here. And they're slightly different. So of course, this guy sings it a little differently, but by and large, the songs are pretty similar to each other, and they sound pretty similar to each other as well. Here's another shared song type. This is again, they share these elements, the buzz, and then this high whistle, and then the kind of complex elements here, and then the trill, like here. And this is another shared song type. And these are unshared song types. These are shared song types that are kind of different from these 2 males' repertoires. Okay, and these are 5 different song types, by the way, for each male. So this will be about half of their repertoire, essentially. Okay. So each male has a repertoire of 8 to 9 songs, and they share a certain amount of these songs with their neighbors. Okay. And it's very actually common in song sharing, is very common. But there's also variation in song sharing between males. So for instance, this is an aerial photograph of part of our study area. And these will be, if these are the territories of 6 different males. So some males might share a lot, with the thickness of the arrows would indicate how much they share. For instance, male 1 and male 3 might share a lot of songs, whereas male 6 and male 2 might share very little songs, but 6 actually shares a lot of songs with male 4, which in turn shares a lot of songs with male 5, etc. Okay, so there's actually a lot of variation in song sharing, and this variation in song sharing comes about through variation of song learning. And we know that from studies that my teacher did and with his colleagues since '86, where he recorded a bunch of birds, young birds that they banded as juveniles, and then he recorded all the adult birds at the time in the park, and then you lay out all these spectrograms that you print out, and then basically play this matching game. Okay, you have to have a really big table, and because there's hundreds of birds, essentially 120 birds at a point that are potential tutors, and for each bird you have to kind of find the match that's for the best match for each song. So if this is a 2T songs, this will be the best match for this song, and best match for this song, and so on. Okay, so 3 of these songs were learned from tutor 1, and 2 of these songs were learned from tutor 2. And oftentimes, for the vast majority of 2T songs, you actually can't find a good match or best match, really. Sometimes you find 2 best matches because they're song sharing, and in that cases you kind of split the credit between the 2 tutors. Okay, and by the way, this terminology of 2T and tutor, that comes from the early Marler studies, which I'm going to get back to this point later, but it doesn't. I'm not yet implying that the tutors are actively trying to teach the 2T's songs, right? They're just for now we're kind of agnostic about that. But as we'll see at the end of the talk, that might actually be happening. At least in this species. So I'm using tutor and 2T like without making the assumption that there's actually active teaching. Yeah. All right. So yeah, this will be the tutor 2T song repertoire, and we're trying to find. This is actually a pretty bad example of this because there's actually a lot of candidates for matching. But yeah, so this is how messy it can get. Okay. And what we know from these studies is there's actually substantial variation in how many tutors a given tutor has, and how many songs he learns from those tutors. And the most of the variation is at this one variable, which is how many songs you learn from your best or primary tutor. Okay, and so some birds, if they have 10 songs, they might learn 2 from one tutor, which will be their best tutor. But other birds actually learn 5 or even 9, or sometimes even 10, all of them, right? So basically clone a repertoire of another bird, right? And this primary tutor, how much you learn from your primary tutor, is basically where most of the variation is. So, and as you can see, this from the histogram, there's 43 birds where we trace song tutoring or song learning from, and you can kind of see most of them learned about half or more of their songs from their best or primary tutor. Okay, and so that's the major dimension of variation in song learning in song sparrows, in our study site at least. Yeah. So, and this best tutor choice or primary tutor choice is idiosyncratic. So if these are the territories of the birds, this is actually from the study that I showed you. For instance, this 2T might have chosen this guy as his best tutor for some reason, right? And whereas this 2T has chosen this guy as his best tutor, right? And this guy might have chosen someone much more distant. Oftentimes these best tutors are neighbors, but sometimes they're not neighbors, and that has kind of interesting consequences as well. But what we don't know why there is this kind of best tutors that seem to be idiosyncratic. There's no like super tutor that tutors everybody. Each 2T has sort of like this kind of his own best tutor, essentially. So we asked, why do song sparrows how do song sparrows choose their tutors, and why do they have a primary tutor in the first place, and why is there so much variation in how much they learn from their primary tutor? So we first I said tutor choice is idiosyncratic, but we first test the hypothesis if there are actually super tutors, and maybe there's like these super aggressive or super high quality individuals that were preferred by everybody, right? So what we did was and we know that song sparrows actually exhibit individual consistent differences in aggressiveness, right? So they have personalities, right? Some of them are more aggressive than others. So we asked whether song tutor choice actually correlates with tutor aggressiveness. And when we did that, we assayed aggression with playback experiments in all of our tutor, or half of our tutor population. That's in 2009. This is what this is a study that actually I did during my PhD. And then we recorded the songs of the first few males in 2010. And then we looked at the song learning from these tutors that we assayed for aggression. And what we found was nothing. As tutor aggressiveness did not correlate with their tutoring success. So the young birds didn't care if you were an aggressive guy, overall aggressive guy, or mellow guy when they learned their songs from you. Okay, So there's no effect of aggressiveness. This is the R square. So basically 0% essentially. So yeah, does tutor aggressiveness affect tutor success? It does not. Okay. So we can rule out the aggressive tutor hypothesis for song sparrows, but now that brings us, that leaves us to with a more complicated hypothesis, right? Potentially. So we came up with two different opposing alternative hypotheses that I'm going to call cooperation and competition hypothesis, just very simplistically. And the cooperation hypothesis is that where song learning reflects cooperative or affiliative relationship between tutors and tutees, and competition hypothesis basically reflects aggressive or competitive relationships between tutors and tutees. And these are very simplified hypotheses, so the reality might be more complex than this, but these are useful to kind of contrast with each other. So I'm going to start with explaining the competition hypothesis, which actually comes from these lab studies with live birds that try to get at social factors. That in the lab, when you put a bird in the same cage, especially, you often see aggressive interactions. And sometimes some of these studies found that the more aggressive interactions, the more the tutor learned from that bird. Okay. So, and in the field, it might look like something like this. The sparse might look like something like this, where a young bird has to establish a territory. It has to do, engage in aggressive interactions with already their territory holders. And therefore, these aggressive interactions inevitably involve singing. And therefore, you hear that bird a lot, right? And the bird that you're fighting with. And you also, it might actually be useful for you to learn those songs of the bird that you're fighting with, right? So these competitive or aggressive interactions with, territorial neighbors might actually positively affect song learning, and you end up learning your songs from the bird that you fight with. Okay. And then we know in song sparrows, for instance, the song type matching actually is used as an aggressive signal. So this is actually a good reason why you would learn this, right? So if you're, for instance, if your neighbor sings a song type A and you have that song type A in your repertoire, you have the choice of responding with song type A, or you have the choice to respond with a different song type that you, for instance, don't share, right? And we know from playback studies that we did in our lab that if you respond with a type match with the same song type that you just heard, then you're more likely to respond aggressively to that bird. Okay, you're more likely to follow that singing with aggression. Okay, so type matching actually does rely to predict aggression in a song sparrow. So this kind of suggests that it might actually be useful as you engage in competitive interactions to learn the songs that you fight of the birds that you're going to fight with, or that you engage in a lot of competitive interactions. Okay, so that's one. That's the competition hypothesis, and why competition hypothesis might hold. Okay, now on the flip side, song learning might actually reflect cooperative or more positive affiliative interactions. Okay, we know from other species, like for instance the red squirrels or red-winged blackbirds, oftentimes these even in territorial species there is kind of cooperative interactions between familiar neighbors, and having familiar neighbors around you is often beneficial for your survival and reproductive success. For instance, in red squirrels, if you live in a high familiarity neighborhood, you're more likely to have to survive, and you're going to have higher reproductive success. Okay, so something like this might actually be happening in song learning interactions as well. And as a young bird establishes his territory, he's actually trying to come up with a kind of cooperative situation with an established neighbor, which in turn is reflected in their song learning. Okay, and in territorial species, there's actually a very common effect called the deer enemy effect, which is basically the reduced aggression between established neighbors, and potentially involving other behaviors as well. But oftentimes it definitely involves reduced aggression. So, for instance, in the song sparrows, once the territory boundaries are established, they sort of ignore when the neighbor sings at the boundary. Okay, they don't respond aggressively. But if you actually hear a stranger singing at that boundary, they respond more aggressively. Okay, so this DRM effect is very common in territorial songbirds, and but there is, even within species, there is a significant variation in the DRM effect. Some neighbors are dearer than others. Okay, and the hypothesis here is that young males might learn most from the tutors with whom they end up being deer enemies, and they end up being in this cooperative or at least non-competitive interaction, non-competitive relationship. Okay. Now, from the old guy's perspective, from the older tutor's perspective, it might be actually good to have a sidekick next to you, younger sidekick next to you, much like Batman and Robin, right? And this is one of the reasons might be extra-pair paternity, which is very common in songbirds, of course. And in songbirds, it accounts for about 25% of the offspring, and it is also mostly extra-pair paternity exchanges, I should say, are happening mostly among older males in song sparrows. So if you are an older male, it actually will be nice to have a younger male because that's less of a paternity threat to you, right? So you're much at a lower risk of losing extra-pair paternity at your own risk. Okay, yes, and you might even actually gain opportunities to get extra-pair paternity at your younger sidekick's nest. Okay. So the prediction is that if the primary tutors are a special type of deer enemies, then tutors should perceive their primary tutors as non-threatening. And the more the tutees learn from primary tutors, the stronger the relation, the deer enemy relationship. And having a strong primary tutor should be beneficial for survival or reproductive success, I should say. Okay. If, on the other hand, primary tutors emerge through frequent aggressive interactions, then tutees should respond more strongly to these primary tutors. And the tutor's presence should confer no benefits and even maybe harm the survival of the tutee. Okay, so these are essentially the same thing. So these are the predictions. Social learning is predicted to be correlated to reduced aggression between tutors and tutees, and according to cooperation hypothesis, and social learning is predicted to be correlated with increased aggression between a tutor and tutee. So the first question that we asked was, how do tutees respond to their primary tutors? So we did a playback experiment where we quantified relative aggression towards the best tutor compared to a stranger, and which controls for the individual differences in aggression between males. So we placed a speaker in the middle of their territories and played the tutor song versus a stranger song, and we looked what happened. Okay. In the cooperation hypothesis, we predicted that as the proportion learned from best tutor increase, the relative aggression towards the tutor should go down, right? According to cooperation hypothesis, because these guys have learned a lot from their cooperative deer enemy, and they should respond less aggressive to this tutor. According to the competition hypothesis, you should see the reverse. Okay, so relative aggression should go up as the learning from the best tutor goes up. Well, the results were very surprising because we kind of were rooting for the cooperation hypothesis, but we found, to our surprise, that tutors elicited a stronger response than strangers, and this actually never happens in song sparrows. In several different playback studies, stranger category is always the highest response category when you do a playback experiment. But in this particular experiment, tutors actually elicited even a stronger response than strangers, which was strange, but it was consistent with this competition hypothesis, right? They really hate their tutors, it seems, in this case. And in fact, as they learned, there was actually a correlation between relative aggression and song learning as well, where if you learned a lot from your best tutor, you actually responded more strongly relative to a stranger to that tutor. Okay. So the relative aggression went up as song learning went up. So this was actually consistent with the competition hypothesis, which was quite surprising to us because we really thought it was going to go the other way. So learning from best tutor is correlated with aggression towards that tutor, which is consistent with the function of song type matching as an aggressive signal. And the more you learn from the tutor, the more effectively you can signal aggressive interactions and avoid costly fights. Now, there's a caveat to this player experiment because we carried these playbacks in 2014, and by then, most of the primary tutors were dead, okay? So what we were simulating was this dead bird coming back from the dead and basically coming to sing in your territory, which is sort of spooky maybe, but it might also simulate a kind of a stab in the back, like this guy lost his territory, now he's out to get mine, even though he's been gone for a while, right? So this might be actually kind of a double cross situation that we created. So that's a little more complex explanation, but it may, that's a caveat, that's a limitation of the experiment. So what about the second prediction that I made about cooperation and competition hypothesis, which is if the cooperation hypothesis holds, somehow song learning should be mutually beneficial to the tutor and the tutee. Okay, so what we did was we analyzed song learning of 3 cohorts of tutees, and this is one of the largest song learning studies that has been done in the field. We traced song learning for 78 tutees, and we kept track of the survival of the territories for both tutors and tutees until 2016, and by which time only 2 tutees and 2 primary tutors were still alive. And then we looked at both the tutors and tutees survival, and we also came up with a new variable, and we came up with this new variable before we did any analysis, which we termed mutual survival. And mutual survival is basically the logic here is that any benefit of song learning, if you're going to see it, it has to accrue when both the tutor and the tutee is alive. When one of them is dead, then you don't have your cooperation partner, so there shouldn't be any benefit to that, right? So what you should see the benefit of song learning in the mutual survival, strongest in the mutual survival, and not just tutor or tutee survival, because once your tutor is dead, you might still go on to live, right? Or once your tutee is that you might still be living on, but you're not going to get benefit from that song learning interaction or song learning history. Okay, so we tested whether song learning affected tutor, tutee, or mutual survival in this paper, and what we found was the number of songs a young bird learned from a tutor, from a best tutor, was actually positively correlated with the tutor's survival beyond the tutee's first year. So it seems to be beneficial to have a strong primary tutee, right? So if it seems to be beneficial for the tutor to, for that tutor to have tutored songs to a young bird. And this is by the way, this is the graph here is on the x-axis. There is the number of songs learned from the primary tutor. On the y-axis, it's a categorical variable, which is number of years that they survived, and we plotted this as a categorical variable, although we analyzed it as a kind of a continuous variable, because beyond the year 3 there was a long tail of 4, 5, and 6, but we kind of plotted them as a categorical variable just to make it pretty, but we analyzed the results as a numerical variable. There is the number of songs a young bird learned from a tutor was not correlated. Sorry, it should read was not correlated with that tutee's survival. Okay, so this effect was not significant. I'm sorry that I forgot the word not there. But if you look at the mutual survival, the strongest effect was in the mutual survival, where the number of songs a young bird learned from a tutor was positively correlated with their mutual survival. Okay, and this was a R-square of 0.13, and that's actually this is survival of how many years they survived on territory, and that's actually not a bad R-square. Just to compare this, there was a recent meta-analysis looking at the effect of personality traits on survival. They found the average effect of personality on survival was 0.79, so 0.08. So this is actually comparatively large effect on survival. Survival is affected by many other variables, and for a behavioral trait like this to have such a large effect is actually pretty remarkable. Okay, so this results shows. And by the way, we also looked at the repertoire size, because everybody is always talks about repertoire size being good for the males, etc. There was actually no effect of repertoire size on survival on the tutee survival. So in fact, there was, if anything, there was a slightly negative effect. So the larger repertoire birds did not survive better per se. So the mutual survival results were really interesting, and they actually supports the cooperation hypothesis. Okay, so we have 2 studies that kind of go in opposite directions essentially. So the playback study appeared to support the cooperation hypothesis, with the caveat that the dead tutors coming back from intruding your territory might actually be very, first of all, non-naturalistic, and second, might actually simulate a social situation where there's a really backstabbing going on. The mutual survival results appear to support the cooperation hypothesis, but with the caveat that we don't really have direct evidence of this lower digression or cooperative acts between the tutor and tutee. Okay, so we have kind of this mixed evidence for cooperation or competition hypothesis. Personally, this is going to be sort of an opinion. I find the survival results more convincing because they are, actually fitness effects. And they're actually also consistent with other results that we found. For instance, one study, one playback study that was done in our lab by my friend Chris Templeton, they found that the older birds actually tolerate younger birds in their territory in the first summer and fall, at least. And so this is consistent with kind of this establishing a relationship between young bird and older bird, right? And we also have some playback data, data that shows that young birds in their first breeding season are less aggressive towards their own song if they learned a lot from their primary tutor. And of course, their own song, if they learned a lot from their primary tutors, that song is likely to be their primary tutor's song. So they might be behaving less aggressively towards that primary tutor that is still around and kicking, right? So that's still alive. So it's not that's not a backstepping situation necessarily. That's just, you know, your primary tutor coming to visit you in that case, right? So so personally, I found the survival result, the mutual survival results, more convincing, and therefore the cooperation hypothesis more likely to be true. But you know, it's kind of open to interpretation like that. Okay. So the next step is obviously to look for behavioral evidence of this actual cooperative or competitive relationship, especially during the period of song learning. And I just want to highlight that the period of song learning that happens in the first year of life oftentimes is a mystery still. Okay, we really have very little information still on the social interaction that happen in this stage. Oftentimes the youngsters are very cryptic. They don't really pop up and sing that much unless they're already territorial. So we don't really know what's going on there. Okay, and understanding that period is going to be really important in kind of disentangling these hypotheses. And we can do that now with new technology, like new tracking technologies and recording technologies that generate a lot of big data, and then we can actually analyze that big data now with more modern data pipelines. Okay, so that's going to be really important. Okay. Just to kind of round off the talk, it will be really good to have more comparative data on more species. Okay, song sparrows are a great model species that had been studied for 40-50 years, ever since Marler started his studies in the lab, and it has been studied quite a bit in the field as well, with Mike Peters and Bill Searcy's studies and Steve Novicki's studies. But beyond song sparrows and a handful of other species, we don't really have a lot of good data on song learning in the wild, about song learning patterns in the wild. If we had more data on song learning from more species, then that would actually allow a lot of more rigorous comparative analysis. Recently, there has been a lot of comparative analysis that's been done, but all of these analysis, all of those papers, when I read them, I'm really just struck by the paucity of the data. There's just, some papers have like 20 species. The better papers have like 60 species, which is still nothing compared to 4,000 species, of songbirds. So we really need more kind of field data from more species about song learning in the field. And then we're going to be able to do more rigorous comparative analysis. So with that, I'm going to stop and acknowledge my co-authors on this work, Mike Beecher, Liz Campbell, and Chris Templeton, and then a lot of field assistants like Veronica, Setra, and Mari, and many other undergraduates who were, in the lab for varying amounts of time that helped with recording and analysis of these data, and our funding sources. And to you, thanks for listening.
Many thanks, Çağlar, for this very interesting and fascinating talk. I'm sure the audience has some questions. I would suggest that if someone has a question, that simply just go ahead and unmute your, okay, I can see one already. So Alper, just go ahead and unmute your microphone and you're free to ask the question.
Yeah, any questions? Anyone?
Yeah.
There is one in chat, I think.
Okay, yeah, you can see.
Oh, okay. I thought was just clapping.
Clapping, okay.
Can I have a question? Hi.
Yeah,
Çağlar, this is thank you. I'm Tamas. I think it's brilliant. I really like your introduction and the way you lead to the story, and I think it's just a fascinating issue. I just kept wondering, the song in passerine birds is usually like a sexually selected trait. Some people do argue that it's sexually selected. I was just wondering whether you could actually look at the success of these tutors in a sexual competition. So would, of course, they survive better, which is probably one component of success. But the other component might be polygamy or extra-perpetuity and that sort of thing. So I'm just wondering whether you could also extend the analysis to look at the plumage, how sexy a particular male is. So what do you think about it?
I think plumage is really interesting because song sparrows are they're not well known for their plumage, but they're actually very pretty, and there's probably a lot of UV plumage going on that we don't really see with our eyes. I don't think anybody's looked at in song sparrows with song and plumage were correlated, with the
are the males incubating or not?
They don't incubate. They don't. All the nest building and incubation is done by the female. As I said, there's a lot of extra-pair paternity. We have one paper that looked at extra-pair paternity in relation to repertoire size and song sharing, and we found we basically found no effects of repertoire size or song sharing and extra-pair paternity. And what we found was that in that paper, we found an age effect, as I said. It was the older males that basically gained and lost extra-pair paternity in their nest or in other nests. So what happened, and we have actually good radio tracking data on this point as well. What happens is that young birds are pursuing a strategy of mate guarding quite rigorously, and during the fertile period of the female, whereas the older birds are more relaxed about mate guarding, but they actually also foray more onto other territories. So what happens is that they both lose and gain more extra-pair paternity, and which seems like a kind of a zero-sum game for them. But that's why it will be really interesting to look at extra-pair paternity in relation to song learning, because I think you're right. So there might be potential benefits or costs in relation to song learning there as well.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point, and you already mentioned the movements, and I'm just wondering whether it would also worth putting a small transmitter on the presumed tutors and the presumed tutees, because it's one thing, the ultimate function. This is what you're looking at: it's cooperation, conflict, fitness, essentially.
Yeah.
But the other issue is a mechanism. How did they find appropriate tutor? There might be tutors who actually just bully these young boys. They just hammer to them until they pick up their song. This is probably human analogy, but of course you can find it. The alternative, if each young boy is meandering in the woods and trying to pick up who will be my idol, like poster Arne,
Right.
So I think this is something what I'm sure that people are already doing, but it would worth definitely looking at movement of the
and Chris Templeton, who did his PhD a couple of years before me, did exactly that. He put a bunch of radio trackers on the young birds, and he had to catch this was in this 2005 to 2006 years. So the batteries were still pretty small, so you had to catch them every month or so, every 2 months at the most, to replenish the tags. And so he was able to follow a bunch of young birds throughout their song learning period. And it turns out to be a really kind of messy data, and I don't think he has yet published that, his PhD, the main PhD paper yet. He has one paper looking at the social networks of the youngsters and how they kind of stick around and each with each other, and how that social network of young birds affects song learning. But yeah, so you're right. The kind of figuring out the movement patterns would be really, really cool. We actually came up with a new technology, even a postdoc in our lab called John Bird came up with a new built a new technology called EncounterNet, which actually was since then used by Dan Mendel and Mark Negri. That actually was kind of focused on figuring out these movement patterns and social networks during the period of song learning, and we never quite kind of got the manpower and funding to make it work in the song sparrows yet, at least I should say. But yeah, so that would be really, really cool to do, to figure out the correlation between early movement patterns and social interactions and song learning outcomes. Yeah.
Let me just ask the last question, and I will mute myself. It's very peculiar to think about social cognition and social complexity. So the societies have different level of complexity. This is DE-EvolZool and many others. The pillars of societies essentially. And I'm just kept thinking, and my intuition would say that the ability to learn and the social complexity not necessarily correlated. Among mammals, for instance, or even birds, you have cooperative breeders. So these are probably the most complex societies in birds. Okay, in mammals, again, we have cooperative breeders. And it just doesn't strike me that the best learners would come from meerkats and banded monkeys, the cooperative breeders. So yeah, so of course there is phylogeny and different rates of evolution in here. But I'm just curious what you think about it. So you did mention in the beginning social complexity, which I think is a hugely important issue. The second one is learning, social learning. So how these two things relate to each other?
Yeah, and so there's several issues there, but one of them is how you measure social complexity, and I think there's a lot of hidden social complexity even in a system like song sparrows, which really doesn't seem very complex, right? So for instance, it's a territorial species, it's socially monogamous species, so on a territory male and female live, and they have neighbors, they interact with their neighbors, but it's kind of like a limited social network. But turns out there actually a lot of eavesdropping going on, and that's kind of an additional social layer of complexity. And what seems to be happening in song sparrows is that they actually have a extended sense of who's doing what in their neighborhood, and they actually can respond to that adaptively. And for most species, we don't really have a good handle on that kind of social complexity that is not obvious in interactions, right? In the cooperative breeding species that live in social groups, that's obvious, right? There's actually many individuals. You have to kind of know your place. You have to know your place in hierarchy if there's one. Act accordingly to your social status, etc. Right? And that's kind of obvious in terms of social complexity. But from that doesn't really follow that these territorial species or monogamous species are less socially complex. I would say they might be, but there's actually this additional layers of social complexity. So how you kind of measure, if you measure the social complexity well enough, is kind of I think one aspect of that. And that second, in song, just remaining with songbirds, because they all learn their songs, right? So there's song learning is basal to all the songbirds. So it kind of is given already with the independent of the social system that they live in, right? And so within that group, I don't actually expect to see a lot of kind of correlation between song learning and social complexity or learning process of social complexity across different groups where song learning or learning of vocalizations or learning of communication signals, I should say, is kind of either present or absent. There might be kind of a positive correlation there, but I would say within songbirds, I actually don't expect such a correlation to be there. Yeah, but it will be actually an interesting question. But as I said, I think for most of the systems, we don't really have a full understanding of what the social complexity is out there. It's a different kind of social complexity, but it's not necessarily less or more or less complex or simple depending on the kind of mating system. Right? Yeah.
I have a question. Hi, thanks for the great talk.
Thank you.
So I assume this song sparrow in Seattle is a year-round territorial bird, right?
Yes.
And so I have a two-part question, actually. One is that there are other subspecies of song sparrows that are migratory, and would you expect that relationship or this song learning dynamics to be different when you have just a limited territorial interaction that's constrained to the breeding period only in those subspecies? And the other part of my question is just, do you guys know anything about the relatedness of these territorial birds, any kinship data that you have, and how does that fit into the picture?
Yeah. So the second part is that oftentimes, and I think in almost all cases, the territorial neighbors, immediate neighbors, and song tutors especially are not related to each other genetically. So they disperse at least about 3-4 territories away from their natal area. And while there might be some extended paternity, and you might end up next to your genetic father by chance, it's quite unlikely, I think, oftentimes, because oftentimes the genetic fathers is also a neighbor if there's an extended paternity. So you end up dispersing away from your natal territory. So the first part of the question is, that's a great question. So the other subspecies of song sparrows have been also studied very well, and in particular the eastern subspecies. There's actually several eastern subspecies, but the eastern song sparrows in Pennsylvania actually have very low song sharing, and we know that they learn their songs not in the kind of whole song manner that we see in the Northwest song sparrows. So in the Northwest song sparrows, they learn this entire song from a neighbor, right, from a bird. Whereas in eastern song sparrows, they seem to learn bits and pieces from the song from neighbors, and they kind of mix and match and come up with a new song type oftentimes. So what happens is that there's actually very low song sharing between the neighbors in the eastern population. And initially we thought, people thought that this is Bill Searcy's studies in Pennsylvania. Initially they thought that this was due to migration, because eastern populations are at least partially migratory. They're not fully migratory actually, but some of them migrate, some of them stay throughout the winter. But that kind of the variation might be responsible for song sharing. But interestingly, there is a non-migratory population in North Carolina that also shows very low song sharing. So that's kind of interesting. And second, there are altitudinal migrants in Northwest song sparrows near Seattle in the Cascades, Cascade Mountains, which migrate down into the valleys in the winter, and they come back to their breeding grounds when the snow melts again. So they're actually kind of away from their breeding grounds for about as long as the migratory sparrows in the east, and they also have high song sharing. So there seems to be no correlation with migratory status and song sharing, and song sharing presumably also happens through song learning in that case as well. And one last population that has been studied in Maine, which is northeast United States, which is very north, and they are definitely migratory, and they also have high song sharing. So that's kind of a really a big puzzle, why some populations have very low song sharing, other populations have very high song sharing, and whether this is actually due to different developmental programs, or different demographics, or different social experience, etc. Right? So one idea that we had for a very long time, since with Bill Searcy's group, is that it will be a really good thing. It will be really interesting thing to do, to bring baby birds from Northwest populations and the eastern populations, and do a common garden experiment in the lab, and see if their developmental programs actually do differ from each other or not. So that's a big unknown, but that's a really fascinating question.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Actually, I would have one question about the mechanisms behind the social learning. So there is this famous gene, the FOXP2 gene, that has been related to speech development in humans and in mice. And I also remember, like 10 years ago, maybe more, there was a study where I think they knocked out the gene in zebrafinch, and that they were unable to learn songs from others. So I don't know if there's any study about especially I'm thinking about an interspecific level, whether there's any patterns in the gene expression of this gene. For example, the indigo bunting that stops learning after the, as you said, the close-ended ones, or the ones that, like the flycatchers, that keep learning throughout their lives. So I don't know if there's a study. I'm not following this literature at all.
Yeah, I'm not following it either, but I think there's, with respect to keeping that window open, I think there's some interesting studies by Tim Wright's lab, and I forget the details, but there were some genes in which you can upregulate and downregulate and kind of sort of close or open the learning period. I think I might be wrong about the details of this, but yeah, so which I didn't really give that much detail, but yeah, that would be really interesting. Yeah, thing to look at. Yeah, I'm really not very well versed in the kind of molecular mechanisms of these song learning. That's it.
Okay, thank you. If there are no more questions, then big thanks again for this very interesting and entertaining talk, and hope you can come at some point in person and do a follow-up talk.
Yeah, thanks Adam for reminding me.
All right, then thank you everybody for your presence, and have a nice rest of your day, everyone.
Right, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.